Hello, everybody. It's Zach here from RealEstateLicenseWizard.com. Today I'm going over another 50 of our 250 real estate exam vocab terms. These terms are super important to know, and of course, yes, you do need to know all of them for the real estate exam. Before I jump right into it, if you want a full text version of all these vocab terms, head over to our site, RealEstateLicenseWizard.com. Anyways, buckle up, and of course, do me a favor and hit that like button and subscribe for more real estate exam related stuff. All right, guys, let's do this. So, as this works, just like before, I read the term, you guys think about it a little bit, and then I give you the explanation of the term. We compare. Oh, and don't forget to keep score. Leave your score down below, and let's see who does the best. All right, let's go. So, the first term for this one is commission. So we did commercial property last time in the first 50, but the first term today is going to be commission. So going to give you guys a couple seconds to think this one over. Go ahead. Okay, hopefully you guys are familiar with commission because when you guys become agents, that's pretty much going to be how you guys are getting paid. So a commission is a fee paid to an agent for performing a transaction. So if you sell a house, you get a commission. If you buy a house for somebody or you're the buyer's agent, you get a commission. So pretty straightforward, simple thing, but an important thing nevertheless. All right, next one, community property. And community property laws. Okay, so yeah, here's a couple seconds for you guys. Think it over. Okay. Do you guys know about community property? Hopefully. So, community property laws are based on the idea that husband and wife are equal, separate partners, rather than one whole one like tenants by entirety. So, this term goes hand in hand with tenants by the entirety. And basically, what they mean is it's a way that law or a government um, or the law developed by the government addresses husband and wife in terms of their property. So, in community property law states, they have this idea that husband and wife are equal, separate partners rather than one whole one. So, in tenants by entirety, which we'll see later, it's one whole one. That they're like one whole um, entity, and community property is they're separate entities. So, that's pretty much that on that one. So. All right, next one, comparables. Okay. All right, so take a couple seconds, figure this one out. Okay. You guys remember what comparables are? Maybe it's a new term for you guys. Let's learn. So, comparables are just another word for property sold in the same area seen on a property report. So, again, when you're doing these property reports, there's going to be a little section. It's like comparables. And basically, what that means is their property sold in the same area, normally not only in the same area, but kind of like the same type of property. So, but that's pretty much what comparables are. They're used on the property report. All right, next one. Here we go. The Comprehensive Environmental Response, Compensation, and Liability Act. CERCLA, and I guess another parenthesis, two parentheses would be, or also known as like the super fund. So, what is that? So, take a couple seconds to figure that out. Okay, so hopefully this isn't the first time you guys have seen this or heard of this because this concept is so important, not just for your exam, but for your career. But basically, this means, also known as a super fund, is a United States federal government program designed to fund the cleanup of sites contaminated with hazardous substances and pollutants. Environmental property law has become so important for agents because obviously we're becoming way more what's the word I'm looking for? We're becoming more cautious, as well as we are stressing the importance of cleaning up hazardous waste and pollutants because obviously that can do harm to our environment. So pretty much this was a law or an act, I'm sorry, in 1980, and it basically kickstarted this whole idea that the government should kind of set some rules for these hazardous substances, as well as establish a fund to clean up these sites. And you're probably wondering, well, why? What does this have to do with me? Well, if you are in commercial property, or honestly, even in residential property, you might see it, and you're dealing with property that might have some hazardous waste on it. It's super important to be familiar with these laws and kind of what the rules are, and how to handle that and things like that. So that's it for this one. We're going to see some more acts a little bit later, so keep that in mind. But yep, that's it. So, all right, next one, condemnation. Okay, so condemnation. So, as always, here's a couple seconds for you guys to think this one over. Okay, do you guys know what condemnation is? Hopefully. Um, when you think of this, think of eminent domain because they go hand in hand. So, the procedure used by a public or private entity with the powers granted from eminent domain, remember I mentioned that earlier, to take privately owned real estate. So these terms go hand in hand. This is specifically the procedure used by it, whereas eminent domain is the right, which we will cover a little bit later. But yeah, it's the procedure used by a public or private entity with powers granted from eminent domain to take privately owned real estate. Ooh, condominium. Okay, so think this one over. Give you guys a couple seconds. Okay, so we did go over co-ops in our first 50 video. And we've gone over the difference between condos and condominiums before, but I'll keep this a little brief. Basically, a condominium, often shortened to condo, is a type of living space which is similar to apartment, but is independently sellable and therefore regarded as real estate. So let me give you a quick explanation here. Basically, remember we were talking about co-ops earlier in our first video. Co-ops, they are owned through a form of interest or shares in a nonprofit. Okay, so you don't actually own a physical living space. You actually end up leasing it, but you own shares in this company that owns the entire space. Now, let's compare that to condominium. A condominium, you actually own the independently sellable area, and therefore it's regarded as real estate. So there is a slight difference there. And the truth be told, if you're driving around your town and you pointed like a condominium complex, you would probably not be able to tell what's a condominium versus what's a co-op just from the outside. You have to understand the rights and how they are organized, and that's how you can kind of tell the difference. So again, a little bit of a confusing concept, but super important to understand. And hopefully, I explained it to you guys good enough. If not, feel free to comment, and I will try my best to explain it in text. All right, conspiracy to boycott. So, okay, yeah, here, have a few seconds to come up with your definition for this one. Okay, do you guys remember this one? Do you guys are familiar with this one? Have you even heard of this one? Hopefully. When you hear this, think of antitrust laws. Conspiracy to boycott occurs when two or more persons or entities conspire to restrict the ability of someone from competing. This is unethical and highly illegal. And I guess I would put, if I had a show, I had my little notes, I would also put in parentheses that antitrust laws. This is antitrust laws. Antitrust laws developed and defined this term and made it illegal. So again, this is the specific act where two or more persons or entities conspire to restrict the ability of someone competing. But again, that you got to circle that back to the antitrust laws, which we talked about in our first video, which are super important to understand. But yeah, this is one of those antitrust violations. So keep that in mind. All right, next one, constructive eviction. Okay, so think that one over. Okay. Hopefully you guys came up with a good definition here. So this is it's this one's pretty basic. I know there's like four lines of text here, but I'm just going to break it down super easily. It's a term used in real property law to describe a circumstance in which a landlord either does something or fails to do something that he has a legal duty to provide. So I know that you're probably thinking, well, what does that mean? Well, basically, landlords not only tenants but landlords as well have a certain amount of duties that they must provide. Just like how a tenant must pay rent every month, depending on their contract, and must make sure that the property is relatively, well kept, and not destroy anything. Well, landlords also have a certain amount of activities that they must do, or if they don't, or they must do, uh, slash if they fail to do, then there will be a legal repercussion. So like, I know that that was a little bit confusing, and I'm sorry, but basically it just means that these if a landlord doesn't do something that they're legally required to do, or does something that's opposite of what they are legally required to do, that would be a constructive eviction. So a little bit confusing, but hopefully I explained that well enough. If not, again, leave a question, and I'll be happy to give you guys an explanation. Okay, the next one is constructive fraud. Okay, so think that one over. Okay, so remember in our last video, we actually talked about the different types of fraud. Well, constructive fraud is another form of fraud, but it's a little bit less. Actually, it's more less serious than actual fraud. I mean, it's still serious, but because it's fraud. But constructive fraud is best described as ignorance or lying without knowing you're lying. So, an example of this would be if you're showing a house and maybe you met with the buyer, or I'm sorry, maybe you met with the seller 3 days before, and the seller was like, "Yeah, okay, it's got 2 bathrooms, it's got 3 closets, it's got 4 bedrooms," and they're describing all this stuff. Well, let's say a week later you're showing the house, and you're like, you tell your potential, there's a potential buyer, you're like, "Oh yeah, um, it's got the 3 closets or whatever I said earlier." Well, let's just say it turns out you get inside and then you find out there's only like 2 closets. Well, you technically lied. That would be considered constructive fraud because it's ignorance. I mean, you lied without knowing you are lying. And again, there's a gray area here. It's kind of hard to prove that you didn't know, but you are technically lying, and it could be fraudulent. Again, there's a lot of gray areas when we're talking about fraud, but that's why it's just best to do your due diligence always. You know, just because somebody says something, make sure you are doing your own research and making sure you are informed as well. That way, you don't get yourself in a tricky situation. But we went on a little bit of a tangent there, but that's pretty much all you need to know about constructive fraud. All right, contingent property. Okay, so gonna give you guys a couple seconds to think this one over. Okay, you guys remember we were going over some contingencies? Well, we're coming full circle now. So, contingencies listed on on a property makes the property contingent. So, contingent property means an offer for a property has been accepted, but there's a condition or contingency that is written into the contract, and it must be met before the sale can go through. So, let me explain. Let's say you have a contingency, maybe an appraisal contingency, which remember we talked about that in the first video. That it's okay, um, they're not going to purchase the property unless the appraisal comes back to a point that they'll be able to buy the property. So maybe it'll be written in there that the appraisal comes back and they don't find any issues, or maybe the inspection, like an inspection contingency, things like that. So basically, they're written into the contract that these things must happen before the sale can go through. That's basically what a contingency is, and to flip that, that's also what contingent property is. So, if you're looking on the MLS or like on a site like Zillow maybe, and you see, oh, contingent property, well, that just means that again, an offer was accepted, but they're waiting to do or for one of these contingencies to go away or to be handled, I guess would be a better way to say it. So that's what contingent property is. Hopefully that was a good explanation for you guys. Okay, next is a contract. Okay, this is a pretty short one. So hopefully you guys know what a contract is. I'm just going to get into the explanation right now. That's just an agreement between two or more parties by law. So pretty self-explanatory, but obviously if you guys are new to this, hey, maybe you didn't know what a contract is. That's totally okay. Remember guys, this is a learning experience. Don't be afraid if you have no idea some of these terms, or maybe I'm not doing a good job explaining it. leave a comment down below, and I'd be happy to explain a little bit better. Or, if for some reason I don't get to your comment, feel free to Google it. But again, don't be afraid to review these things and kind of take the extra steps so that you understand these things, because this can be really confusing for a lot of people. You're not alone there. So, okay, the next term is corporation. So, give you guys a couple seconds to think this one over. Okay, so if you guys are fans of the channel, you'll remember that last week we actually did cover some business structures, and corporations were one of them. So a corporation can be formed for profit or nonprofit purposes, and a corporation is managed and operated by a board of directors. They have certain rights, privileges, advantages, disadvantages, all the good stuff. Here's the key takeaway. I'm going to keep it simple with this. You need to know that a corporation can own property, and it's not the individual, but it's the corporation. So, unlike a sole proprietorship, which we'll cover a little bit later, a corporation can own property by itself. So, that legal entity can own property. So, remember that. Super important to know, as well as all the business ownerships, because again, for commercial property, you have to be familiar with these things. So, okay, cost approach. All right, so go ahead and take a couple seconds and think this one over. Okay, do you guys remember what this is? Is this a new term for you guys? Let's see. So, cost approach is a real estate appraisal method that states the price a buyer pays for the property should equal the cost to build an equivalent building on property. So, a little bit of an explanation on this one is, let's say somebody built a house in like, let's say like it's last year, and they sold the house, and then the appraiser comes in and they appraise the house. Well, they're going to look at how much it costs to build that house because it's relatively new. Here's the thing: this appraisal method is not going to work if the house is from like 1920 or 1930. I mean, they still might use it, because again, when they're doing these appraisals, they take a lot of these methods and they kind of use them all to come up with the best evaluation. But again, all this is uh, they're looking at what the buyer would have to pay for the property if for some reason it was destroyed. If And by pay I mean like pay to rebuild it. So, but yeah, that's pretty much it for that one. Okay, counteroffer. Okay, this is a good one. So, gonna give you guys an opportunity to think this one over. Okay, so a counteroffer. What is that? Well, it's similar to a purchase agreement. However, a counteroffer is made or makes the original offer cease to exist because legally the seller rejected it. So the key takeaway here is a counteroffer is basically a purchase agreement. However, when they make the counteroffer, the original offer ceases to exist because legally it is rejected, and that's a key takeaway. That again, once you present the counteroffer, the original offer is no more. Okay, looks like we're going into the D words. Okay, so next one is datam, and I know I'm probably butchering the pronunciation of this word, but you know, yeah. So here's a couple seconds for you guys. Okay, is this at all familiar to you guys? If not, it's okay. This is kind of a weird word. It comes up uh, what's it called? Not with appraisals, but with surveying. That's right, surveying. So basically, what it is the set of data or data, however you pronounce it, that equals heights and depths measured on a horizontal plane. So this is used in surveying, because that's basically what they're doing. They're looking at the heights and depths of properties and things like that, and they're using it to measure exactly where things are. So it comes up more in surveying, but uh, for a lot of states, surveying does show up on the exam. So you have to be somewhat familiar with the terms. I mean, it's not a huge portion of the exam, but it does show up. So that's it for that one. Okay, DBA. So this one, I'm just gonna skip this one, the seconds here, because this one is a pretty small explanation. But basically, that's doing business as. It's an abbreviation, and you may see this on the exam. in one of those word problems where they're like, they put a big paragraph of all this information and they use all this mumbo jumbo, and you have to be familiar with some of the abbreviations. And DBA is doing business as. Right. Next one, debt. Okay. Here's a couple seconds for you guys to think this one over. All right. Hopefully, you guys are familiar with this term. Hopefully, you guys aren't too familiar with this term, if you know what I mean. So, debt. Debt is just something owed or promised. It's pretty self-explanatory. If you owe something to someone, you have debt. Um, yeah, it's simple as that. All right. Deed. Okay, here we go. Deed. A deed is a written legal document by which ownership of real estate is conveyed from one party to another. And I just realized that I just gave you guys the explanation before I gave you guys an extra a second to think it over, and I apologize. But um, yeah, that's pretty much it for this one. So I'll try not to do that again. I'm sorry. But yeah, so that's that. Pretty self-explanatory. I'm sure you guys are familiar with deeds. If not, we actually do have a video on deeds, so encourage you guys to watch that. All right, next one. Oh, it looks like we're staying in the ballpark of deeds. All right, deed restrictions. So here's a couple seconds or moments to think that this one over. Okay. All right, deed restrictions. What are deed restrictions, guys? Well, they're limitations to use of property imposed by past or current owner and are usually legally binded forever. So, what's an example of a deed restriction? Do any of you guys know? Well, I'll give you guys one. So, a deed restriction, that is going to be something like, let's say somebody has a historical property and maybe there's a tree on it. And maybe that tree was Benjamin Franklin's, maybe like he discovered something under that tree. And the owner imposed a deed restriction on the property that tree cannot be cut down, no matter what. Legally, it cannot be cut down because that is a deed restriction. And guess what? Somebody new buys a property, they can't cut down that tree because it is legally, it's a legally binding agreement. And as soon as you get that deed, um, that's basically it becomes legally binding to you, to current or future owners. So simple as that. I know I guess it's not as simple as that. I know that that's a little bit of a complicated concept for some people, but again, it's something that you have to know for the real estate exam. So hopefully I explained it well. If not, leave a comment down below. Okay, defeasance clause. Oh, goody. So, if you guys are fans of the channel, you guys will be familiar with this one. All right, here's a couple seconds for you guys. Okay, are you guys familiar with this term? Hopefully. So, this is a contract provision that ensures that the title for the property is transferred to the buyer once the mortgage is fully paid off. So now you're probably sitting there thinking to me like, okay, what? Like, why would that need to be in a contract provision? Well, it's super important to not only have these contracts be as thorough as possible, but be as distinctly specific as possible. I think that's a good way to phrase it. Because listen, guys, contracts can be super confusing, and that's why they put it often on the exam, a lot of these contract provisions, and that's why we cover it on this channel a lot. It's because it can be confusing. But basically, what this means is once that the buyer pays off the property, uh, or once they pay off the mortgage, that is, they own the property. The title will be transferred. And again, it's important to distinctly clarify this because, again, imagine if you just paid off. Imagine if you just paid off like $100,000 house, $200,000 house, and for some reason there's a contract issue, and they didn't clearly define that when you paid off the mortgage, you would retain the rights to the house or the property. Could you imagine how frustrating that might be? So again, it's super important to have this in the contract, and as this states, it's typically required. I believe in every state, it's not, maybe not every state, but it's pretty much required almost in every state. So keep your eyes out for the defeasance clause. It's super important to know and understand. Okay, delinquent taxes. So this is another short one. I'll give you guys a second or two to think this one over. Okay, so delinquent taxes. What is that? That's just overdue taxes. Why is this important to know? Well, when people foreclose and when there's overdue taxes or delinquent taxes, this stuff shows up, and it's super important that you're familiar with the terms so that you sound intelligent as well as are familiar with it for the real estate exam. Delivery. Okay. So, not DiGiorno's, and it's not a lame joke there. It's not delivering pizza or food or something like that. This is the real estate term for delivery. So, uh, give you guys a couple seconds to think this one over. Okay, are you guys familiar with this in the real estate perspective? So basically, all this means is the legal act of transferring ownership. So when you see delivery, think of this: legal act transferring ownership, delivery transferring ownership, or I mean, honestly, you could make it even shorter. Delivery is just transferring ownership. You don't even really need a legal act. I mean, really, but it's as simple as that. That's what it's defined as, and that's why it has to be defined. Is because it's a legal term that again um, is relevant not only to your real estate career but for the exam. Okay, depreciation. All right. Here's a few moments for you guys to think this one over. Okay, so do you guys remember when we talked about appreciation? Well, I mentioned that the opposite of appreciation is depreciation. So, using that as some context clues, you should know what depreciation is. Depreciation is any loss in the value of property over time from any cause. So, obviously, there's different types of depreciation, which we'll cover a little bit later, but depreciation is not really a good thing. And I know that I said this in the first video, but a good way to remember appreciation is if someone appreciates you, it makes you feel good, meaning you gain value. Um, with depreciation, you could remember as depre or depressed, almost depreciate, depressed, loss. Thing is sadness. So like you'd be sad if you lost a value of property. That would stink. That would be horrible. And it does happen. So again, that's kind of how I remembered that one, but that's all you need to know for that one. So, all right, discount points. Awesome. Okay. So, discount points. Give you guys a couple seconds to think this one over. Okay. Do you guys know your discount points? Hopefully. So, discount points, also known as mortgage points, are just prepaid interest. So, the way they work is you would pay an extra amount at closing um, in return for a lower interest rate. Now, this is fantastic if you know for a fact that you're going to be living in the house or owning the property for a long time, because this could save you massive amounts of uh, money, basically. Because, again, it's just like any type of investment or investing. Often it's better to pay a lot in the beginning, and that way you can reap the benefits for later. But yeah, that's it for the discount points. Dividing territories. Okay, so think this one over. Okay, so did you guys figure it out? Hopefully. So dividing territories. What do you guys think of when you hear that term? Well, you should be thinking of antitrust violations. Yep, it's another one. So, dividing territories is when competing brokers agree to split territories and divide interests accordingly. As I mentioned, it is a clear antitrust violation. So, imagine you are sitting together and let's just say you're a real estate agent or a broker, and another broker from a competing agency comes up and he's like, "Hey, listen, I have this great idea. What if you get the west side of the town? I get the east side of the town. We live in a small town. We could easily do it. I won't take any, thing from you over there. You don't take anything from over there." And yeah, that would be totally an antitrust violation, totally illegal, and totally unethical, and could potentially lead you in a lot of trouble. So never do that, obviously, but be familiar with the term. because again, antitrust violations is a huge part of the exam, and a huge part of your career is knowing those things. Okay, dominant estate. All right, so I'm going to give you guys an opportunity to think that one over. Okay, dominant estate. What is that? Do you guys know? So the dominant estate is a parcel of real estate that has an easement over another piece of property. So I would say the way to remember this is the fact that it's dominating. It's dominating, meaning it's dominating over another piece of property. It's the main one. It's dominating over it, and that's what it is. It's property that has an easement over another property. So an example would be if you had this might be a little hard to explain, so bear with me. Close your eyes and kind of think it through. But imagine you live on the second story of a let's say you live on the second story of an I don't know about that. Let's say you live on the second story of a building, okay, and you have an easement through the alleyway of another property to get to your property. You are the dominant estate because you have an easement over the other state, um, or estate. And we'll explain what the other term for this one is. The non-dominant estate is a little bit later, but yeah, just remember that for this one. Okay, a double net lease. So think this one over. Okay, this is a pretty easy one. Double just means two. It means two additional costs will be added to your base rent. So usually there are things like taxes, insurance costs, and they're just added to the monthly lease payment. So pretty self-explanatory, but super important to know. Duress. Okay, this is a good one. So think this one over. Here's a couple seconds for you guys. Okay, duress. Duress is the act of forcing an individual or business to do something against their will. So, um, obviously, that doesn't sound great, right? When you hear the word duress, I kind of think of stress. But duress is the act of forcing an individual or business to do something against their will. Obviously, it's not a great thing, uh, and I believe it's illegal. Actually, I'm pretty sure it's illegal. But yeah, so when you hear duress, just think of stress and the fact that it's against their will. All right, next one, dual agency. Okay, here's a few seconds for you guys. Okay, so dual agency, you might be thinking, oh, well, dual means two. That means maybe, I don't know, two agents work on the same project. Well, no, it's a little bit different than that. Dual agency occurs when one agent represents both the buyer and the seller in a transaction. Now, whether or not this is illegal completely depends on the state that you live in and their rules. And if you are curious about this topic, we did a full video deep dive on it, as well as we have an article on our site where you can find out whether or not it's legal or illegal in your state. So, pretty much it for that one, but it's super important to understand that it's when one agent represents both the buyer and the seller in a transaction. Okay, DVA loan. Okay, give you guys a few moments to think this one over. Okay, when you see DVA, you got to think of Department of Veteran Affairs. So all that is a loan certified through the Department of Veteran Affairs. All right, next one, easement. Okay, we talked a little bit about this term earlier, so now we're coming full circle. All right, so think this one over. Okay, you guys familiar with easements? Hopefully. I know if if you're a subscriber on this channel, you better be. Okay, an easement is a right held by one person to use the land of another for a specific purpose, such as driving through someone else's property. So, as I remember, or as I was describing earlier in the dominant estate, that's where this thing comes into play. An easement is just for a specific purpose, like maybe driving through someone else's property, or maybe walking through someone else's property to get to uh, your property, things like that. But estate or easements are super important to know. So if you did not know this, I encourage you guys to uh, look this one up. We actually did a deep dive on this one as well, and kind of familiarize yourself with that term and all the things that are connected to it. Okay, we're sticking with easements. So easement for ingress and egress. So I'll give you guys a few moments to think this one over. Okay, so you guys know about this, hopefully. What is an easement? Well, we just talked about what an easement was. Remember, it's a right held by one person to use land of another for a specific purpose. Well, an easement for ingress and egress is a type of easement, and it is a type of easement used for entering and exiting a property. And you're probably thinking, Zach, why do we have to define this? Like, that's kind of like that doesn't make any sense. Well, okay, because there's different types of easements, and but believe me, there are quite a few. Yeah, they have to define each one, and this is probably like the most basic form of easement. But it is the right to be used entering and exiting property. Now, where it comes into play, which I think, yeah, we'll talk about it now. But where this really comes into play is obviously, if think about it like this: if you can enter a property, you should be able to exit it, right? Right? Well, yes. So ingress and egress rights, they go together. So that's worth noting, because of course, when you hear, you'll never be like, oh yeah, you're allowed to enter this property, but you're never allowed to exit. So typically, these rights, they go hand in hand. All right, and sticking with that egress, we'll just jump into the explanation. That's just the right to exit property. So, as I mentioned, ingress is enter, egress is exit. So, you'll probably see ingress in when we cover the I words, but important to know and important to understand and familiarize yourself with. So, all right, next question. Oh, here we go. Economic obsolescence. So, think that one over. Here's a few seconds for you guys. Okay, so um, basically, economic obsolescence just refers to the loss of property due to external factors. And that's the biggest, most important part about this is it's external, meaning things that are off the property affecting the property's value. Because as you'll see a little bit later, there is a different form of obsolescence, but we'll jump into that later. All right, so that's it for that one. Emblements. Okay, so here's a few seconds for you guys. Okay, so do you guys know about emblements? Hopefully, if you're uh if you're a fan of this channel, you should. Okay, emblements. They are annual crops produced by cultivation legally belong to the tenant with the implied right for its harvest, and they are treated as tenant's property. So this is a super specific term, but it does come up on the exam because there are a lot of I don't know if you picked it up on it yet, but there's a lot of terms that start with E that you need to know for the exam, and this is of course one of them. And basically, what this means is, let's just say you rented or leased property from somebody, and it was this big farm, and on that farm you grew crops. And you kept growing them for a couple of years. Well, let's just say the owner of the property decided that he wants to sell the property to somebody else. Well, you are legally, you legally have the right to harvest those crops because they are the tenant's property. So, again, it's a specific term, but believe it or not, this shows up on the exam all the time, and I'm not entirely sure why because it's so specific, and most people don't really aren't ever going to have to deal with this in their real estate career, but it's just something super important to understand, not just for the exam, but for your overall uh, well knowledge. Okay, eminent domain. So here's a few seconds for you guys. Okay, so do you guys remember what eminent domain is? We talked about it, I think, in our first video. Eminent domain is the right of the government to take over privately owned real estate for public use. So, let's say you own a house and it's right next to a highway. You've been living there for like 50 years. While the government comes in and they're like, hey, we're going to take your land and we're going to extend the highway. Guess what? 9 times out of 10, you don't have an option. Like, that's it. You you have to give up your land. And basically, you know, they're using eminent domain, which is the right, to take over your land. That way, they can develop that highway. So that's an example for you guys. But again, eminent domain is super important. Comes up on the exam all the time. So make sure you guys are familiarized with that. All right. Next one, encroachment. Oh, okay. Here's a couple seconds for you guys. Okay. Did you guys figure it out? Encroachment. Encroachment is intrusion on a person's territory or property. When you hear encroachment, think of like someone like encroaching on you or approaching almost. For those who are football fans, you should be familiar with this. Encroachments, it's kind of similar to the penalty encroachment. But basically, yeah, it's just intrusion on a person's territory or property. An example of this would be maybe if you had a tree and it was starting to grow over your neighbor's, towards your neighbor's side. And maybe he's not happy about it, and he has the legal right to have you take care of it or deal with it. So that's basically what encroachment is. Okay, encumbrance. Okay, so think this one over. Okay, so do you guys know about encumbrance? Well, whenever I see this term, I think of being encumbered, um, which means like, you're being weighed down, and it kind of means the same thing. So encumbrance means an involuntary lien is on the property. So what's that? Well, we'll get into liens a little bit later, same thing with involuntary liens, but basically it just means that there's one on the property and you're not happy about it. If you have an encumbrance on your property, you should not be happy because this means that there's some sort of thing holding it back from you either owning it or from you possessing full ownership of it. So this is a bad thing. But again, just remember that this just means a involuntary lien is on the property. Okay, endorsement. All right. So here's a couple seconds for you guys to think this one over. Okay, this one should be easy for you guys. I'm sure you guys have heard of endorsed. Well, it's the same thing, endorsement. It's just a signature, it's signing paperwork, normally a contract. So again, you're just going to be signing paperwork. You're doing an endorsement. You're endorsing yourself, whatever it might be. It just means signing. Okay, next one, EPA or Environmental Protection Agency. Alrighty, think this one over. Okay, are you guys familiar with the EPA? So I talked about environmental law a little bit earlier, and basically the Environmental Protection Agency is the federal agency responsible for dealing with environmental issues. The EPA was established in December 1970 by an executive order of the United States President Richard Nixon. So you don't need to know Nixon did it probably, but you do need to know what the EPA is, and of course that it was established in 1970. So the key takeaway here is that before then there really wasn't anything to deal with these environmental issues, and thankfully now there is, and that's what the EPA does is it protects us, protects not only us but nature as well, and it deals with environmental issues so people maybe not following the correct rules when it comes to like hazardous waste. There's tons. I mean, now the EPA is much larger than it was back then, but originally it was just basic environmental issues. So, but yeah, it's super important to know for us because why? Well, for those of you guys who might work in commercial real estate, obviously you have to make sure that these properties that you're showing are following your Environmental Protection Agency guidelines. And nothing would be worse is if you showed a property to somebody and you misled them and you told them that everything's up to date when it might not be. So be transparent with your clients, and good things will happen to you. So okay, another phrase, Equal Credit Opportunity Act, or ECOA. So think this one over, come up with your guys' explanation. All right, you guys familiar with this? I know this is a little bit of a, you know, it's a little bit of a stretch here on the terms of like if you guys know this one or not, because if I'm being completely honest, I wasn't really familiar with this until I kind of learned about it, practicing and doing all the stuff that we're doing now in my own version and when I was doing it in my time, because you don't really hear much about this. But you know what's interesting is if you look on certain documents, you actually see, like at the bottom, it'll be like protected by the ECOA or protected by the Equal Credit Opportunity Act. And you might even see it on commercials for like mortgages and stuff like that. But yeah, it's something that like once you hear about it, like you're like, oh yeah, I know what that is. But basically, all it is a regulation that aims to give all legal individuals equal opportunity to apply for loans. The act prohibits creditors and lenders from considering a consumer's race, color, national origin, sex, religion, or marital status in deciding whether or not to approve their credit application. So let's just say you're applying for a house and maybe you are young, and let's just say you're young and Christian or something, and basically it doesn't matter what you're young, old, black, white, from Canada, from United States, from Mexico, male, female. Creditors cannot be like, oh, well, because this person is, so and so, they shouldn't get this loan. No, of course that's not allowed. But again, this is something that is defined, and it's so funny because I guarantee it. After you guys learn about this, you'll be watching a commercial or you'll be like reading something. You'll be like, oh my God, yeah, that was the thing. That was the thing that guy on YouTube was talking about. So, yeah, that's the Equal Credit Opportunity Act. Super important to know for your career and exam. So, hopefully, I explained that one well. Equitable title. This is one of my favorite terms. Okay, so think this one over. Here's a few seconds for you guys. Okay, so we actually did a deep dive on this one, and I encourage you guys to watch the video if you haven't yet. I love talking about this stuff, and I thought we did a really good job explaining what this is. But so equitable title is the interest held by one party to purchase property before closing. So if you have equitable title, that means you have the right to purchase property, or to purchase a specific property. So maybe you put an offer in, and maybe the offer was accepted. So then you would have equitable title. You don't have full title, you don't have actual title, but you have equitable title, meaning it's like you're in the process of getting title. I hope that makes sense. I know it's like a little bit of a confusing concept, and I encourage you guys to watch our deep dive on it if you haven't already and you're a little bit confused. But yeah, that's pretty much equitable title. All right, next one. Equity. So we're keeping with the EQ words. So equity. What's equity? All right. Here's a few seconds for you guys to think this one over. Okay. What is equity? Do you guys know? Equity is the difference between the market value of your home and the amount you owe the lender who holds the mortgage. It's pretty simple. Let's say you and your husband or you and your wife just purchased a home, and maybe after 2 years, you guys have put in a good amount on your loan, and you want to know how much equity you actually have in the house. Well, you would look at the market value of your home, and then you would take the amount that you owe the lender, and you would you would look at the difference, and that's how you'd find how much equity you have in the loan. So super important to know. All right, next one, erosion. Erosion. Okay, think this one over. Gonna give you guys a few moments here. Okay, what do we know about erosion? Well, We know a couple things. We know that it's the opposite of accretion. Remember, we were talking about that earlier? So, erosion is the wearing away of land or soil by the action of wind, water, currents, or ice. Long term erosion can decrease the size of a property. So, remember, we were talking about accretion. Accretion. Remember, like, we were talking about that like super early. I think that was like, what, like our eighth one or ninth one? But anyway, we were talking about that and what that is. And remember, that's the slow process of growth or acquisition of land. And then remember, we talking about the other term as well. But this is the long term, or I'm sorry, this is the opposite of accretion, meaning the wearing away. So accretion is the growth or acquisition, and this one, erosion, is the wearing away. So I hope that makes sense. I know that there's like a couple of these terms that they can easily be mixed up, but yeah, just keep this one in mind for future because again, it's another one of those ones that's super important. Okay. Oh, errors and emissions insurance. Okay, this is a good one. All right, so here's a couple seconds for you guys. Okay. Fun fact about errors and emissions insurance: some, but not all states, actually require a form of insurance of errors and emissions insurance for a lot of different careers, not just real estate agents, but there are some other types of careers where error and emission insurance are required. So, basically, what is it? Well, it's a type of excuse me, it's a type of liability insurance that protects professionals against claims of inadequate work or negligent action. So, it's good to have. And again, it's one of those things that's required in some states, but it's good to have if it's not required, just in case somebody opposes a claim on you for not doing your job correctly. If there's a lawsuit there, this can protect you from that. So. All right, next one. Escheat. Okay, another one of my favorite terms. Escheat. All right, so here's a few seconds for you guys to think it over. Okay, do you guys know what a sheet is? If not, it's no biggie, but you gotta know now. A sheet is when a property owner dies and leaves no proper documented inheritance plan. The property ownership reverts to the government. A sheet ensures the property always has ownership. So when you think of a sheet, um, it's it's one of the government's rights or government powers, and basically, um, it just means like let's say you and your wife or you and your husband are living happily, and then you guys just sold a house, and then you bought a new one, and then let's just say you have no sort of inheritance plan, and you guys both pass away. And I know this is like so specific, but this is like the best definition for this. Well, if you have no inheritance plan, the property ownership then reverts to the government. So it's kind of a crappy thing. But the point is, and why government kind of created this, why our government created this, is so that there wouldn't be a lot of properties that were just sitting there empty with like an owner that was dead or something. Um, a sheet ensures that a property always has ownership, and that's important not only for uh, a local economy, but a global economy, and how much of an impact that is, because you want people to own property, and you want people to live in houses and things like that, and you need ownership always to be there. So, all right, escrow. Okay, escrow. All right, so here's a couple seconds for you guys to think this one over. Okay, so do you guys know about escrow? You should. Escrow is super important. So, escrow is a way for money and property to be transferred from one party to another through the use of a neutral third party agent, also known as an escrow agent. Escrow makes it a lot safer for both buyers and sellers to close the sale without worrying about getting snubbed or cheated. Listen, it's as simple as this. If escrow didn't exist, there would be so many potential issues with transferring property. Because imagine this. You know, uh, Imagine you're like buying property and you had no sort of protection. It would be scary. Not that many people would purchase property without escrow, because it would be it would increase the odds of people getting, screwed. So escrow is super important, but all it is just a third party to handle transaction. Basically, simple as that. So, all right, estate at sufferance. All right, so here's a couple of moments for you guys to think this one over. Okay, you guys know what an estate at sufferance is? A good way to remember this is it's suffering or suffer. So it's an estate at sufferance. This is when the tenant holds over after expiration of the term. So imagine someone is not paying their rent, and yet they're staying on. Well, actually, there's a couple ways this could be. So, an estate of sufferance could be that their lease ended and they're just staying there rent free, or it could mean that they are staying there, they're still paying, but they don't have a lease. But either way, it's a bad thing, because you want to have a lease. You want these people to be paying month to month legally. You don't want an estate of sufferance. It's always a bad thing. So again, remember estate at sufferance, estate at suffering or suffering, suffer. That's how I remember that one. So okay, next one, estate at will. So we're sticking with the estates here. Give you guys a moment to think this one over. Okay, so what is an estate at will? Well, an estate at will means it can be ended at any time, which that kind of is a good and bad thing. It can be kind of scary. So this term of estate is indefinite. So it also so basically what this means is like if you and I were we were like owning, like let's say we own property and we had some tenants on it and we developed them at a month to month lease. So that would be, kind of good and kind of bad. And basically, because they could pay the rent monthly, but you know they could leave at any time. Or if you're the owner, they could be like, hey, we're kicking you out next month. Like it's not really good, and that's why it's an indefinite. And of course, what it says here is it's also important to note that not all states recognize an estate at will. And of course, these things do vary in state laws. But yeah, so that's the key takeaway. Is it's an estate that's indefinite and it can be ended at any time. Um, contrary to the estate of sufferance, which we were just talking about, where that's when a tenant holds over past the expiration, and they're suffering. This one is more or less just month to month. Like this is the in the states that this can be done, it is perfectly legal. However, it's not suggested, but it is like legal. Whereas like the state of sufferance arises more or less like, okay, the terms expired, and yet they don't have a lease, and like I said, they could be paying like under the table, or maybe they're not paying at all, so they would be suffering. And this is more at will. It's like, okay, well, it's month to month. It's like whatever you guys want. So again, important takeaway too is not all states recognize this, but a little bit of a tangent there. But I thought it was super important to explain kind of the difference for you guys while I could, while you guys were watching, so you guys could learn more. So, all right, next one, and it looks like our last one for this video. So think this one over. It's exchange. What is an exchange? So listen, I'm not going to give you guys a couple seconds for this one. This one's easy. Come on, it's a transfer of goods and services. So why do we need to define this? Well, listen, guys, as I mentioned earlier in this video, and even in the first one, all these terms, some of these terms you may be thinking, oh, well, yeah, they're easy, I totally understand this. But listen, for a lot of people, this is new stuff for them. For a lot of people, this is like brand new territory. And you know what? If you guys are getting all of these and you guys are fully understanding, power to you. But I encourage you guys not to put other people down that are not understanding this, because this can be very hard for a lot of people. So just for those of you guys who are still struggling, keep your heads up. We got 155 more questions to go. We're going to get through this. We're going to learn. And you know what? Someday, whether it be next week or next month, you're going to pass the exam. I believe in you. Our whole community here does. I'd really love for us to be more positive in the comments, as well as try and bring more people up. Because let's be real, guys, we're all in this together, and the more that we can help pass the exam, the better for everybody. Really, for everybody. But yeah, I know I went off a little bit of a weird tangent there at the end, but I thought it was important to be said because, I really care about this community that we're developing. We're going on like 2,000 subscribers now, and I really want us all to uh, build each other up because guess what, guys? We can do this. You can pass the exam, and it's going to take hard work, but you can do it. So yeah, that is it for this one. We're 100 questions down, and guess what? If you guys made it this far, wow, you guys are doing fantastic. You're doing stellar. Keep up the great work. We're almost halfway. And again, the next video, you'll see sometime soon. But yeah, so if you haven't liked or subscribed yet, please do. It really helps out the channel. But yeah, that's pretty much it for me on this video. That's gonna be it. So thanks so much for watching. As always, this is Zach from RealEstateLicenseWizard.com. Make today magical.